Jean-Claude, you have talked before about some diseases, lack of will, lack of trust, lack of strategy, as for me are really quite important. No? Probably clusters are about human people, but are about strategy, about focus, about cooperation, and trust. Trust probably is the heart of clusters, and cooperation is the blood, or something like that, in some kind of this metaphor. Could you explain a little more your point of view about these apparently soft issues, but in the end, very, very important issues?
Yes. My expertise, I was the president of a cluster for 3 years. But it was at the beginning, you know, and when you begin with a white paper, and you have to start. But the first thing you must be sure is to define a strategy. But it cannot be a strategy decided by one person. You must, around the table of members of the cluster, ask them to make themselves the strategy. On top of that, you have to be sure that the strategy is linked with the will of the policy makers. And then it's where the problem is. Because the policy makers, and mainly regional policy makers, what they are looking, it's the election or the re-election. And we know when you have been managing companies that you need a bit of a long-term strategy. You need to give time to the time, you know. And that is the weak point of, I think, the clusters. And also, I agree with you that to see the success of a cluster is how a cluster can be self-sufficient. And if you reach that goal, and if, of course, you need at the beginning to receive an injection, but then after that, you must be able to use your own blood and to regenerate your own blood, you know. And that you can do it only if you have a good team and you have a real strategy. Without that, you know. And also, it will be my last analysis. It's the risk is to elaborate a scheme or a strategy. But this world is changing so fast. With internet, for example, and what is going on around the world, and if you are too strict and too conservative, I think maybe you will miss the purpose of clusters. So you have to elaborate all the time and ask, do I am, you know, still efficient and on the good way? So you must be humble.
A short contribution by Emiliano.
Well, I would like to clarify something which has to do with this idea of cluster management being formal, not formal. I mean, when we talk about cluster management, we don't refer to cluster organizations. When you talk about self-sufficiency, all clusters are self-sufficient or they don't exist. Cluster association or cluster organizations are different subjects. I think we need to clarify a cluster, which is a reality, a cluster association or a cluster organization, which is an entity which receives money. And so the cluster management applies to places where there is no cluster manager. You know, the whole concept of cluster management developed by Professor Beccatini in the 70s and 80s was about the idea there was the social capital in one of these Italian cities that managed the cluster, even there was nobody who was a manager. But cluster management meant that when somebody was a bad supplier, the rest of the country, the city stopped buying from them. When somebody was not doing his job was punished and when was doing his job was rewarded. That is management. So I just wanted to clarify this because in international forums, every one of us calls things differently. And I think when you say a cluster, you think of a pôle de compétitivité. And when I talk of a cluster, it's about a reality. Cambridge is a cluster, and Silicon Valley is a cluster, and they don't need to have any cluster management, and they don't receive any public money for cluster management. No? They receive money for other things. So just to clarify that, when we're talking about cluster management, we're referring to that. It may be an organization or not. It may be willing or unwilling. It will be formalized or unformalized, but somebody's making that kind of decisions and putting all these things that we meant into that cluster in organization. Just that.
Okay. Last question for Thierry. What about lobbying? You have told before, lobbying is a temptation for cluster organizations, and probably is when you have a successful cluster. Obviously, you gain in capacity of interlocution with policymakers, with politicians in general, and so. But in my opinion, it's only a side product. It's not, shouldn't be the focus. What do you think about lobbying, about capacity of interlocution and all these things?
Thank you. Well, in fact, the concept of lobbying is very much linked to what you just said about what is a cluster, because you draw a distinction between cluster and pôle de compétitivité. And that's obviously at the heart of the debate, in the sense that when you lobby at European level, if your question is directed to that, and then you realize that the interests of the different stakeholders at European level are very different. We are an heterogeneous model. So, and listening to what you said about the Cambridge cluster, obviously, which is a generated cluster with mostly by private funding, but also because it's university-driven. I was in Boston a couple of weeks ago, and the Boston-Cambridge cluster wouldn't exist without the power of the universities in the US, and they aggregate a lot of things around them. In France, the policy originally was driven by the state, but nonetheless, it was also coming from the bottom up. It wouldn't been going on without, anyway, the funding from the private sector. It's different approach, in Europe. There's continental Europe, and within continental Europe, different models, and the rest of Europe also. So I think it's a heterogeneous model, and the lobbying is really to try to get this message across at European level. And that's why you get some policies that don't move forward, because basically the interests are just not the same. And people do not give the same definition to the concept of cluster. I'm very much aware about that. But at least in my point of view, if I put my systematic hat on, what I realize when we do in my job on European international level, what we realize is that to get a special interest about systematic and pôle de competitive generally at European level, we realize that there is no, in the current EU program, there is no particular aspect which is specifically dealing with pôle or clusters. There's no funding in particular for R&D project, which gives a particular a bonus to being part of the cluster, to my knowledge. And this is what we would like to push. That it gives additional opportunities for organizations like ours, and I guess with other organizations in Europe. So the lobbying really, it really much depends on what you want to push forward, and in Europe, that's very tough.
Yes, speaking on this level, and as far as it will be part of our tactics initiative with policy agenda, we really believe that we need to align European policies toward clusters policies in order to have better tools for clusters policies, as you said. It's all.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. I think we have run out of time. Thanks a lot. I think has been a very, very valuable contributions, and I hope it has been interesting for the audience. Thank you very much.